نسلم على رسوله الكريم الحمد لله وحده والصلاة والسلام على من لا نبي بعده أما بعد. Inshallah ta'ala, we will start again with our lessons, a weekly lesson on Ilmul Kalam, the knowledge about theology of some sort. And there's some detailed lessons we've already had, about 3, alhamdulillah. So Sheikh Abu Aliyah, as you all know, is going to talk us through the further part of this article that he's written recently. So inshallah ta'ala, we'll go over that. Today's topic is going to be around Kalaam and Imam al-Ghazali, rahmatullah alayhi's contribution to his views and some of his writings, inshallah ta'ala. Let's just start off. Jazakallahu khairah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Over to you.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallam wa barak ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lah. Wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluhu amma ba'd. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Welcome one and all to another discussion, another online class concerning Ilmul Kalam, the science of rational or discursive theology, which by the 2nd century of Islam had made its way into mainstream, was making its way into mainstream Sunni orthodoxy. And by the 3rd century of Islam, had pretty much rooted itself. And by al-Ghazali's time, the 5th century of Islam, it had become a formal subject to study in the various centers of Islamic learning. And it had, through a history which involves a bit of political struggle, charisma and personalities, societal fitness and societal change, it had over the Ilmul Kalam, and particularly the Ash'ari manifestation of Sunni Ilmul Kalam, had taken over the popularity of the simple Hanbali creed, which as we saw last week, the Hanbalis do differ on whether to use Ilmul Kalam in Aqidah or not. But those who rejected it, they kept to the simple creed, and that creed in the capital of the Muslim world at that time, Baghdad, the Hanbalis were quite comfortable in and this is, we're talking about the late 300s, mid 400s. The late 4th century to the early 5th century, the Hanbalis had made quite a mark on Baghdad political society, and they had the patronage, the support of some of the rulers, and the Qadiriya creed, which was a standard Hanbali creed, was even read out at various mosques in various readings by the order of the Caliph Al-Qadir Billah, hence the word Qadiri creed. Likewise, you had phenomenal figures round about that time, Sheikh Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, rahmatullah alayh, as Imam al-Ghazali was leaving Baghdad for his journeys. A young Sheikh Abdul Qadir al-Jilani arrived in Baghdad and made his home there for the next 50, 60 years. And so there was that the Hanbali creed, or the basic creed, Sunni creed, was supplanted eventually by Ilmul Kalam and the Ash'ari creed. And in the lands to the east, the Transoxiana lands that we would call the Russian provinces, northern India, and places like that, the Ilmul Kalam creed took the form of the Maturidi Sunni creed. Today, what we want to do is look at Imam al-Ghazali, rahimahullah ta'ala, and now we're getting down to really the nub of things, how useful or beneficial ilmul kalam is or isn't to the Muslims of today. And who better to speak about this than Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, rahimahullah ta'ala. So point 14, before discussing how relevant the Ilmul Kalam project is for today, let me address its role in the pre-modern Muslim scholastic period, as explained by none other than Imam al-Ghazali. As a sort of epilogue to his Jerusalem Creed, so the Jerusalem Creed is a small Aqidah text that is found at the beginning of his Ihya Ulumuddin in Kitab al-Ilm. As you know, al-Ghazali breaks Ihya Ulumuddin into four parts: ibadat, acts of worship; mu'amilat, the normal human transactions, buying, selling, marriage, divorce, things like that. Then the muhlikat, those destructive traits of the heart: kibr, hasad, jealousy, envy, riyah, showing off, so on and so forth. And then the fourth quarter of the book is mu'bikat, those salvic matters, or the munjiyat, not mu'bikat, the munjiyat, the salvic matters: love for Allah, patience, tawakkul, so on and so forth. So these are the four quarters of the Ihya Ulumuddin, and each quarter has 10 books each. So altogether, Ihya Ulumuddin contains 40 books. And in the first book, Kitab al-Ilm, is where you find al-Ghazali's Jerusalem Creed, his small risala on Aqidah. It's also been published separately as well. So as a sort of epilogue to his Jerusalem Creed, al-Ghazali outlines the pros and cons of Kalaam, explaining that the Islamic Aqidah, which Muslims should know, is not the same as Kalaam theology, which is there to support the Aqidah and protect it from heresies. So the Aqidah is one thing, and the Ilmul Kalam is like a support structure to support the Aqidah, the Sunni Creed, and to defend the Sunni Creed from any outside intrusions, innovations, misguidances, or heresies. So he explains, and I quote, this is from the Ihya. He writes, rahimahullah ta'ala, in it there is, talking about Ilm al-Kalam, in it there is benefit and harm. As for its benefit, in those situations where it is beneficial, it is ruled lawful. What is the hukm on Ilm al-Kalam? It is jaiz, lawful, okay, in those situations where it is beneficial. It is ruled lawful or recommended or obligatory according to the circumstances. And it's mashru', it's prescribed either as allowed, recommended, or required. As for its harm, it is forbidden whenever and for whoever it is harmful. Its harms are that it creates doubts and unsettles beliefs, which then no longer rest on certitude or resolute conviction. This is something which happens at the outset, at the beginning, and there is no guarantee that he will ever win it back through rational proofs, for it differs from person to person. This then is its harm to sound beliefs. Al-Ghazali saying the benefits is it can defend the Sunni creed from innovations and heresies, but the harms of Ilmul Kalam, which is where it will become haram, is that it can create doubts. Why? Because someone has a basic, simple aqidah, and they don't get into all of this rational to and fro, logical, counter-logical arguments. They just simple aqidah they have concerning Allah and the Akhirah. And then they come across these very abstract ideas. And for some people, Al-Ghazali says, it can create doubts, and it can begin to make one's belief or aqidah shaky. And then when it becomes shaky, it's not a guarantee that yaqeen, certainty, can be restored to the shaky heart. It might do, or it might not do. But Al-Ghazali is saying, don't be too surprised that once you rock the boat, that boat will continue rocking and moving, and it will be kind of difficult to keep your balance. Once you start down that road, there is always that possibility that the kind of thabat, the kind of inward stability of the heart would be lost. So I wrote at the end of that, the believer yearning above all else, yuriduna wajhahu, seeking the face of Allah, will pay this matter much heed, and we should give this matter much attendance. And I think, I obviously I definitely include myself in the early days, in the mid 80s, probably up until into the early 90s. It's a case for many of us whereby our zeal, our desire and our zeal outweighs our wisdom and our concern. And this is not just a problem for lay Muslims. This is also a huge problem for Tullab al-Ilm and ulama, especially if those ulama are at the lower rung of the ladder of scholarship. Why? Because without sufficient experience with people in teaching them or giving them dawah, we are often driven by zeal, zealousness, and we forget the pros and cons, the wisdoms, what is the right type of medicine for the right type of person. In fact, it probably won't be an exaggeration if we say that today, even amongst the students of knowledge and those scholars who are at the beginning of the ladder of scholarship, they tend to have one medicine for everybody. No doctor would ever agree to this idea in the medical world, that one medicine will deal with all of the illnesses and the diseases. No, different diseases require different medicines. And some medicines you can take all in one go. Other medicines you have to administer drip by drip or bit by bit. Well, knowledge, ilm, is a shifa, is a cure. It's like a medicine. There is a different type of medicine for different types of people. And some people can take a lot of medicine all in one go, and other hearts need to be drip fed. When we don't have the wisdom or the experience, and then worse still, if we lack the prophetic concern, the concern that the Prophet ﷺ used to have for people's welfare and guidance, when we lack these things, then normally we are overcome with eagerness, keenness, and zealousness. Yes, let's just teach. Let's teach this knowledge. This is important knowledge. Let's teach it. Not realizing, well, is it going to benefit or is it going to harm? So Al-Ghazali tells us straight away, ilmul Kalaam, it can be a cure and it can be a disease. Point 15. Continuing the theme of Kalaam's potential harms, the Imam, yani Al-Ghazali, rahimahullah ta'ala, says, quote, "It has another harm, namely that it hardens the beliefs of the heretics. It hardens the beliefs of the mubtadi'ah, of the innovators, in their bid'ah, and strengthens it in their hearts, in that it riles them up and increases their resolve to persist in it." This is something which we experience all the time. If we try to correct someone, supposing someone has a mistake in their Islam, and I try to correct them, I try to make islah, rectification or correction to them, but I do it in a harsh way or in a disrespectful way or in an attacking way, then all I'm likely to achieve is that the person who I'm trying to correct, his ego will come up, he'll become a bit stubborn, he will then start not wanting to listen to me. And even if he didn't think about trying to support his ideas with proofs and intellectual arguments, he'll start thinking about doing that. Okay, so Al-Ghazali takes us to this psychology of human beings, that oftentimes ilmul kalam, trying to rationally argue dialectically with opponents, tends not to soften people's hearts. It becomes a challenge, and when a human being is challenged, they normally, their armor, whether their egos become hard and their tone becomes hard, and they're just fixated on winning the argument. That's what quite often happens. Al-Ghazali continues by saying, such harm, however, arises from bigotry born of argumentation. This is why you see the ordinary unlearned heretic, al-mubtadi al-ami, the innovator who is just a layperson. So he is not really an innovator, but he is a layperson who is following bid'ah innovations. This is why you see the ordinary unlearned innovator quickly dissuaded from his beliefs through gentleness, unless he has been raised in a place where argumentation or zealotry are rife. In which case, if all mankind, from the first to the last, united together to remove it from his heart, they wouldn't be able to do so. For desire, zealotry, and contempt for his rivals or opponents so grips his heart and thus blinds him to the truth. Such is the fatal disease that plagues cities and peoples, the sort of corruption caused by partisan disputation, by hizbiyya disputation. This is also its harms. This is also the harm of ilmul kalam. It can do that. And that's not what we want to do, because in the end, we may push someone into further bid'ah, and actually by the end of our engagement with them, they are in a worse position with Allah than they were before we started our engagement. And we're not allowed to do that, and we need to think about that. So I wrote, in light of that, there's little we can do except to seek Allah's refuge from our self-serving egos masquerading as truth seekers. It doesn't just happen. Al-Ghazali says it doesn't just happen in Ilm al-Kalam. In the Ihya al-Ulumuddin and in other books of his, he talks about madhab bigotry as well. He talks about how in his time, especially Shafis and Hanafis, the bigotry that they had towards their schools, was he considered very disgusting and very un-Islamic. So you have all types of bigotry. My parents, I'm going to make a statement just as an example, but I will just to preface it with the fact that my parents were from South India, Bombay and Bangalore, my late parents, rahimahullah. So it's not that I'm kind of anti-Indian, but I remember as I was beginning to practice in the mid-80s, beginning to take my Islam seriously, it was one Ramadan, and this alim, this big alim, they called him a Shaykh al-Hadith. He came down from India, and he spoke at one of the big masjids in my town, or near my town in East London. And part of the, it was in Urdu, and part of what he said was that the Quran was revealed in Arabia and best recited by the Egyptians and best practiced by the Indians. Because the majority of the masjid was Gujarati Indian, they all said, MashaAllah, Alhamdulillah, and all this kind of thing. So I, being young then, quite rebellious, from the middle of the mosque, I said, Astaghfirullah. And, so people near me turned to me and they were making a big hoo-ha about it. And I was just saying, Astaghfirullah, what kind of bigotry is that? How does he know? How does he know it's best practiced by Indians? Has he lived with the Mauritanians? Has he lived with the Habaib, not the Habaib in Yemen? I didn't know the Habaib, but has he lived with the Yemenis, I said? Has he lived with the Malaysians? So this happens even from ulama, and it's something we must be aware of. Why? Because for an ordinary Muslim, it's disgusting. For an alim or a talib al-ilm, it's even worse. Okay, we must be focused on haqq, on truth, and insaf, on fairness and justice, whether it's for us or against us. And as Imam Ibn Taymiyyah was once asked, it's in the Majmu' al-Fatawa, he was asked, can we say that Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal is the best of the Imams, and Sheikh Abdul Qadir al-Jilani is the greatest of the Mashayikh? And Ibn Taymiyyah answers by saying that the vast majority of people who talk about these things and prefer one Imam to another or one Sheikh to another, he says they do so based upon hawa and nafs, upon their false desires and their ego. He said, the only way you can begin to work out preferring, does one Imam have a higher status than the other or one Sheikh over the other, is if you're already at that level to judge. He said, which is not the case for the vast majority of people, including the ulama. How can someone judge who was a greater faqih in fiqh between, say, Shafi'i or Abu Hanifa, for example? And with what criteria, with what standard are you going to use to judge who was a better faqih? And it's no good looking towards statements that Imam Shafi'i might have made, I can't remember if he has, but Imam Malik has made about Abu Hanifa, or vice versa, because they don't tell you necessarily who is, a greater faqih. In fact, in the case of at least two of the Imams or three of the Imams, it's hard to tell. It's hard to tell. And likewise with the sheikhs of Suluk and Tasawwuf, how do we tell who is the greater? Sorry, yes. Oh, sorry. So again, with the sheikhs, how do we tell who is the greatest arif billah amongst the mashayikh? What we can tell is the works that they did. So Shafi was the first to write a book on usul al-fiqh. Abu Hanifa was the first to systemize fiqh in the way that we normally use it now, for example. we can talk about these type of things, but that's not saying one is overall better than the other. So Ibn Taymiyyah, he gives good advice. He says you should leave all of this. Why? Because it's qawl bila ilm. It's qawl bila ilm. It's speaking without knowledge, and this is unbefitting for a Muslim, let alone a learned Muslim. So Al-Ghazali is, mashallah, one of the things that you'll find, and I'm sure some of you have already engaged in your scholarly careers, this brilliant Imam Al-Ghazali. He not only deals with fiqh, usul al-fiqh and ilm al-kalam, but the spiritual and psychological natures of people, he deals a lot with that as well, inshallah. Shall we move to point 16? So those were some of the harms of Kalaam. Okay, there are more harms that Al-Ghazali spoke about, but the harms are that it could harden the heart, it could make things worse, it could unsettle hearts that were already upon their sound fitra and simple aqidah and cause doubts to come into their hearts. It can make hearts bigoted and have hizbiyah in them, and then it becomes competition or it becomes a threat. This is what historically you see happens quite a bit. However, on point 16, Al-Ghazali, on the benefits of Kalaam, the Ghazalian insight may come as a surprise to some. Yeah, I was really surprised when Al-Ghazali said this, quote, as for its benefits, yani the benefits of ilmul kalam, as for its benefit, it might be expected that it is to uncover truths and to know them as they truly are, if only that were so. Kalam theology is simply unable to fulfill this noble aim, and it probably confuses and misguides more than it reveals or teaches. If you had heard this from a hadith scholar or a Hashawi literalist, you might have thought, people are an enemy to what they don't know. So hear this instead from one highly versed in Kalaam, who left it after gaining mastery of it, who plunged its depths as far as any theologian can, who then went on to immerse himself in other sciences closely related to Kalaam before realizing that the path to the haqa'iqul ma'rifah, the path to the realities of knowing Allah, gnosis, was barred from this angle. By my life, Kalaam theology is not void of revealing, defining, or clarifying some issues, but it does so rarely, and about matters that are already clear or that could probably be understood without delving into the art of Kalaam at all. Rather, it has one single benefit: to guard the common man's creed, or to guard the common man's aqidah that we have just outlined in the Jerusalem Creed, and protect it by way of argument from the misgivings of the innovators, of the heretics. For the common man is weak and can be unsettled by an innovator's argument, even if corrupt. Yet something corrupt may be rebutted, may be refuted with something less corrupt. Whereas people are only responsible for the creed we have previously outlined. Over the past, I think, just about 10 years, speaking to some Deobandi mashayikh, it seems like the Deobandi ulama really got in this regard their priorities right, in that they kept ilmul kalam away from the masses and contented with teaching the masses some basic things about Tawheed and Shirk and some basic aqaid that would generally keep their deen, their religion, firm and sound, and then it was just a matter of amal, practice. And that was working well and successfully, it seems, until the modern times, especially given the last 40, 50 years, when it seems like the kibar of Deoband, the Deoband elders, who were first generation, who were founders and first generation and second generation of those elder scholars of Deoband, they set a curriculum which was very successful in producing abids, worshippers of Allah, who know their basic aqidah and who know their basic ibadat and akhlaq and can get on with life. But with secularization swarming majority Muslim countries and swarming the Muslims of India, which is not a majority Muslim country, obviously, it could then be argued, as one or two of the mashayikh that I spoke to, one was very clear about this, that no, we are now failing because we haven't addressed these contemporary issues, and we're unlikely to be able to address them thoroughly if the best of us don't learn English at a good level, simply because much of this material exists in English now. And that is the lingua franca of the world, including the scientific world for all intents and purposes. So Al-Ghazali is saying people just need to know their aqidah. So point 17, just to kind of put that in context, what Al-Ghazali said, quite surprisingly. Dr. Salim, can we just scroll up a little bit so I can just see the end of point 17? All right, got it. All right, brilliant. Point 17, in Muslim Spain, in Andalus, some 2 centuries after Al-Ghazali. So Al-Ghazali dies when? Can anyone remind me? He dies in 5? Anybody? Does Al-Ghazali die in 505 Hijri, or am I mistaken there? Okay, I stand open to correction. In my mind, it's 505 Hijri, but I'm not quite sure that's actually. No, alhamdulillah, it's downstairs. Okay, 2 centuries after, Ibn Juzay al-Kalbi, one of my favorite mufassirun. Okay, and Dr. Salim will remember that we went through his spiritual discussions in his tafsir on dhikr, on tawakkul, on sabr and whatever, a number of years ago in one of the brothers' houses across the Eastern Avenue. So Ibn Juzay al-Kalbi was an 8th century scholar. Okay, so 2 centuries after Ghazali, Ibn Juzay al-Kalbi, a celebrated Maliki jurist, usuli and mufassir, felt that he could speak to the role of Kalaam in these terms. So Ibn Juzay is living in Spain when Spain hadn't been conquered yet by the Spanish, where the dominant madhab was the Maliki madhab, where the dominant paradigm in Aqidah were the Ash'ari scholars, and where, mashallah, there was just such a brilliant level of scholarship in every branch. The level of scholarship is phenomenal. And this is where, for example, now I can say this now, having studied with some Maliki scholars, having, you know, accessed some of the great books by these great Spanish Maliki scholars. Had I known what I know today about Maliki scholarship, had I known at that time when I was sitting in that bayan in the month of Ramadan as a young 18-year-old, when the person said, and best practice by the Indians, and I said, astaghfirullah, I would have shouted it out 1,000 times louder, astaghfirullah, because it's just so untrue, and it's so it's so blind to say that about one's own people. On top of which, it's, you know, if it's not true, then it's a lie, and also it's denigrating Muslims, millions and millions of Muslims. But this happens a lot, and we need to check our souls that we don't get into that. Otherwise, I could really say, really, you want to look at scholarship, leave India, Pakistan, leave Middle East, and you look at the brilliance of scholarship that came out of Muslim Spain in all of the ulum, and you will be just totally amazed. You'll be totally amazed. But what happens? I'm a Shafi, I'll leave humbly because there's hardly any humblies. I'm a Shafi, I'm a Hanafi. Khalas. It's not going to occur to me that there is some level of absolute brilliance. Why? Because my madhab has to be made dominant. My madhab has to be, my sheikh has to be. And this is not the sunnah, my brothers. We really need to. How can we rid this from the hearts of lay people if tulabul ilm and mashayikh have this in our own hearts? So we need to do some serious tazkiyah. And, you know, as I said, Al-Ghazali used to complain about this, about the ulama and their attitude, time and again, this attitude. He said this attitude, when the ulama have it, it destroys societies, because they pass this darkness on to other people, to the awam. So the Maliki jurist, he says, Ibn Juzay, so he's talking about a time when Islam is strong in Spain. Really, there wasn't any foreign ideas coming into it. He says, as for the heretics, the mubtadi'ah, their words must not be related, nor are their arguments to be rehearsed unless there is a need for it, in which case one may occupy themselves with refuting them, just as Ali and Ibn Abbas radiyallahu anhuma did when the matter of the Khawarij began to spread. This is what called the leading Kalaam scholars, mutakallimun, such as Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari and Abu Bakr ibn al-Tayyib and others, may Allah have mercy upon them, to speak about this when the various heretical sects arose in their time. But as for our age, Allah has relieved us of this duty, since the innovated sects do not exist, especially in the lands of West Africa and Andalusia, especially in West Africa and Muslim Spain. Hence, in our time, the views or their views, yani the views of the mubtadi'ah, the innovators, should not be turned to, nor made to cross any heart or ear, because it is harmful and without any benefit. For the potential benefit of refuting them is meaningless in their absence. For the harms it contains of falling into the forbidden, opposing the salaf, of darkening the hearts, are all present and possible for whoever concerns himself with it. In other words, I'm putting it in my own words, or to put it another way, Ibn Juzay is insisting that Kalaam theology is a medicine that must be administered at the right time and in the right dosage. In the absence of any illness, there simply isn't a need to administer a remedy. To do so would be pointless. More than that, it might not actually create an illness where there was none before. If we can just scroll up a bit. What is also worth remembering is that whilst discursive arguments no doubt have their place, whilst ilm al-kalami type of arguments undoubtedly have their place, sometimes one just needs to listen to the inner voice of conscience or fitra in terms of intuiting or feeling the presence of God, yani the hadra, to feel the hadra of Allah Jalla Jalaluhu. So when Al-Ghazali says, look, if there is not a need to deal with ilm al-kalam, then don't deal with it. Ibn Juzay gives us a practical example of, in his time, that whole region, West Africa and Andalusia, Allah had shielded it for some time against all these heresies. Just like Allah Jalla Jalaluhu had shielded Medina in the time of Malik and his teachers like Az-Zuhri from the innovations and the innovators that were spread across the Muslim world, especially in Kufa and in Basra and in other regions of Iraq. Malik and Medina of his time, and Medina just a generation before him, they didn't have these Ahlul Bid'ah. So likewise, Ibn Juzay is saying Muslim Spain was a bit like that, which soon changed because of the political infighting. And then obviously when Muslims start to infight and the greed of the world gets to them, and then they start stabbing each other in the back, and they start splitting up into groups and parties and families and tribes and whatever, then they become easy picking, which is exactly what Spain and Ferdinand and the Queen is exactly what they did. They came and they decimated Muslim Spain and tore it apart in a way that it has never been restored since then. So Al-Ghazali is telling us, be careful of using ilm al-kalam as a medicine. Make sure that there is a disease for you to administer a medicine. Then make sure you diagnose the extent of the disease so that we don't give more medicine than is necessary, because sometimes giving too many tablets causes more harm. Giving too much chemo does more harm. That's probably an extreme example, but you get what I'm saying. So shall we leave it there? That was section 3, and then there's the last section, which this brings us nicely onto our final concern. Does Kalam theology have any relevance today? Which is really where we wanted to go. Should we do that next week, Dr. Salim?
Inshallah ta'ala. Jazakallah khaira, jazakallah khaira. Inshallah ta'ala. Any questions or comments? You can type in, or you can unmute yourself and do in turn.
Dr. Salim will tell you, my brothers and teachers, and if there's sisters there, that it is very damaging when we don't take on this issue of bigotry and hizbiyah, even when it comes to religious issues. It does destroy brotherhood, and it does distort the truth, and it's a widespread illness that shows itself up in various ways, always negative, always negative. So if you find some of the things sometimes I say is quite sharp, then please do forgive me, but it is just a common experience, not just with one set of people or one area, but throughout. And so I kind of resolved in my mind from my early days of practicing Islam that I would try to always avoid that. And I can't say that I'm 100% successful, but on the whole, bi'idhnillah ta'ala, I'm always aware of the scales that I use to engage people and to judge others with, not judge as in negative, but just to weigh up them. And I would then expect those scales that I've used on other people, they would be the same scales I'd have to use on myself, and the things that, and the sheikhs and the scholars that I like, because we can't have one scale for me and another scale for others. That's the essence of hizbiyya. That's the essence of bigotry and partisanship. Now, yeah.
Jazakallah khair. Yeah, so just to be aware, as you would realize, in many different talks, you would find shuyukh mentioning certain things. So no one should think that this is specifically against a group of scholars, against another group of scholars, or someone else. It's just a general comment. So one shouldn't feel that, Shaykh himself is from India and his Shaykh is Deobandi as well. So don't feel that he has got some bones to pick with Deobandis as well. So
sorry,
I don't have that idea at all. This is general trend that we are seeing among our learned people. Sometimes if they're not seasoned enough with regards to their knowledge and also with regards to their tazkiyah, people do go into this debate and start questioning others. Are we at the best? Our group is the best. If I'm Tablighi Jamaat, so I'm the best. Everyone else is a footnote. If I am from the Barelvi group, so I am the Taifa Mansoura. Everyone else is slightly outside of it, and so no one should consider themselves to be the Ark of Noah alayhi salam. Everyone else outside is actually not with us. So inshallah ta'ala, we should have that much openness when it comes to detailed theology or detailed matters. We're not talking about essential. Sheikh is not trying to say, since I've studied with him for many years, so I can say that, inshallah ta'ala, that we do not have those boundaries within Islam. We're not saying that everyone, for example, someone rejects Quran as the ultimate authority and there are certain changes in it. Someone who does believe that there's no value for hadith with regards to its authenticity or its being hujjah, we accept them as well. Or someone who said the Prophet Muhammad was not the final prophet, though he was, but in one way and not in the other way. So we can have openness. We're talking about the orthodoxy, and within the orthodoxy, the ijtihadi matters, there are many different shades and different views, and we should accept all of them, and although we stick to our point, but don't disturb or don't be bigoted against someone else, inshallah ta'ala. I hope this is what Sheikh is trying to say.
Absolutely. If I can, I have another story to add to that, actually, which is the opposite of what I've said, or the example I gave, which is that when I started practicing Islam, like in the mid-80s, and then I would come across some of the Arab teachers from Kuwait, from UAE, from Saudi. So many times they would say, where am I originally from? So I'm born in the UK, but where am I originally from? That's what counts. So I'd say from Min al-Hind, from India. And it used to be that a lot of the sheikhs would say, are there many Muslims in India? I said, yeah, there's more Muslims in India than the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen, and all these places put together, I said. And they would be surprised. And then they would say, are there any scholars in India? And I would say, yeah, of course there is. One of the things I found was that some of the, many of these Deobandi Kibar, who have also written in Arabic, it's the Arab-speaking, the scholars from the Arab-speaking world are seem to be under the impression, not all of them, but some of them seem to be under the impression that unless you're kind of like a born Arab from an Arab country, then you couldn't be a scholar like the Arab scholars are. Sheikh Abu Hassan Ali Nadwi rahmatullah alayh, when he came to the UK, I was too young, so I wasn't there. I read a transcript of the talk in Urdu, then in English, said back in the 70s that one thing we need to be careful of is that merely because someone speaks Arabic and can recite Quran nicely, don't think that they are muftis. Okay, and he was saying it to many of the Indian Pakistani people in the UK, that as soon as they hear someone speaking Arabic, oh, it must be an alim or something like that. No, not really. But anyway, so my point was, some of the level of scholarship of, I can't speak about the Barelvi ulama because I'm not acquainted with them, with the Deobandi ulama and their output is really amazing. And a few of the just munsif ulama from the Arab world would recognize it and supported it. So, for example, Maulana Zakaria, rahmatullah alayh, he has a commentary on the on Imam Malik's Muwatta, not Imam Muhammad's Muwatta, Imam Malik's Muwatta. I think you have it on your shelf, Dr. Salim, right? And it has an
Awjaz al-Masalik, yes, here.
Yeah, Awjaz al-Masalik, and it has a foreword or by one of the Malikis, one of the greatest Maliki sheikhs of contemporary times, passed away now, from Medina. And he said that when he read this commentary, he couldn't believe that this was a Hanafi alim and not a Maliki alim. And likewise, the Sheikh Abu Fatah Abu Ghudda, rahmatullah alayh, in some of his books has written that the level of hadith scholarship in the Indian subcontinent is absolutely phenomenal. And some of the tahqiqat, researches and editing and researching and commenting on the texts that the Indian scholars have done, and that's primarily Deobandi scholarship. I could be wrong, but that's from what I know. He said it's phenomenal, and unfortunately it's really underrated. You know, people should be accessing this much more. So, you know, it works both ways. You have kind of a bigotry there, whereas the irony is, barring scholars like a few scholars like Imam Malik, most of the great imams of the Salaf were non-Arabs. Okay, there's Shafi was Qurayshi, no doubt, but I'm talking about more, you know, Sufyan al-Thawri, Sufyan ibn Uyayna, Ishaq ibn Rahawayh. So all these kind of imams, including the imams of hadith, very few of them were Arab in the sense of geographical Arab. Of course, they were all Arab in the sense of they spoke Arabic as a primary language, which makes them an Arab according to one definition. So yeah, so it works both ways, inshallah ta'ala. There's a lot of good things that people could benefit from some of the writings of the senior Deobandi figures of the recent past, rahimahumullah ajma'in.
There's a question about what productive uses of Ilmul Kalaam did Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayh make? What is his thing was positive?
In brief, we'll get to it next week, but in brief, all he's saying is where the Aqidah is under attack from deviancies, innovations and heresies, and they're not going to use Quranic verses to attack the Aqidah, they're going to use rational and logical arguments. Then Ilmul Kalaam has to be used to refute on the same grounds, rational, logical arguments, the attacks against the Aqidah of Islam.
Jazakallah khair. Just briefly about a recap of the earlier Aqidah plus the Ta'wili Aqidah. So just to have Athari, Ashari and Maturidi, just a brief overview so that people can relate back to the initial talk when we had all that discussed. So some people are still getting it mixed up and muddled a bit. So they wanted to say, can we just say, is Aqidah, or ultimate Aqidah is the Aqidah of Salaf al-Salihin, which is that of Kulli Tafweed, or is it all three of them? Or can we say, oh, that first one was not needed or not valid now? It's only these two contemporary Ash'ari and Maturidi are the main ones. How do we put them all together?
Okay. It's possible that there is a peppering of confusion here. This question that's just been put is not about the actual content of the Aqidah. This question is more about the methodology in Aqidah. When Al-Ghazali says that Ilm al-Kalam is only there to defend the Aqidah, what he means is literally that. Here is the content of the Aqidah, Aqidah Tahawiyah, okay? The Jerusalem Risala of Al-Ghazali, for example, the Risala of Ibn Abi Zayd, Usul al-Sunnah of Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, for example. And all of this is, all they are is what we believe, or نقول في توحيد الله معتقدين بتوفيق الله أن الله واحد لا شريك له إلى آخر الجملة. You know, all it is we believe this, we believe this, we do not believe this, we do not believe that. The content of creed, the content of the Aqidah, let's just call that Aqidah, creed. So Al-Ghazali is saying, Ilm al-Kalam should be there to defend the Aqidah creed. Now this question, when it comes to the Sifat of Allah, should we just take them as at face value, or can we do figurative interpretation, ta'wil? Then this is not a question of the content of the creed. This is a question of the methodology of the creed. Our discussion is about the content of the creed. Ibn al-Juzay is saying, we don't need to use Ilm al-Kalam because the content of the creed in our time is all safe and secure. Okay. Is that clear? So the issue of Ash'ari, Maturidi, Athari is slightly different than the content of the creed. Okay. Muslims should just know the basic content of the Sunni creed. They don't need to be Ash'ari, Athari, Maturidi, as much as they need to know the content of the Sunni creed, which, for example, simplifying Tahawiyah, for example, or Tahawiyah itself would be a really good thing for especially educated lay people to hear on a yearly basis. That, you know, over a weekend or 2 weekends, the masjid just reads to them the Tahawi creed, and every year it gets read to them just as a reminder. Brilliant. That will half the job will be done, inshallah. The issue of Ash'ari, Maturidi, Athari, then I think I already spoke about that early on. There are two views about these schools. First and foremost, by Athari, let's call it traditional Hanbali, not to confuse it with some of the teachings of Imam Ibn Taymiyyah and the kind of Salafi school that sprung up around him. Even though originally the word Athari and Salafi are mutaradif, they are synonymous, they're one and the same. But nowadays the word Salafi is very much to do with a Taymiyan, Ibn Taymiyan type of emphasis. And he had a very unique position than mainstream Hanbali Aqidah, which we call Athari Aqidah for the sake of discussion. So there are two opinions of who is the school of Ahl Sunnah in Aqaid. One group is, it is only Maturidi and Asharis that are the school or schools of Ahl Sunnah in Aqaid. Why? Because if you take, in reality, Aqidah Tahawiyah, if you're really meaning to be correct, precise with Dabt and Itqan, Aqidah Tahawiyya isn't really theology. It's not really doing theology. It's a bit like this. If I say to you, okay, the arkan of the salat are A, B, C, D, E, okay, very simply, I've not really done fiqh. Fiqh is a bit more than that. Theology is a bit more than just saying, we believe, we believe, we believe. That's aqidah. Theology is like, you know, having the tools and the hermeneutics, the explaining capability, the methodological capacity to understand what is the right aqidah. So in that sense, Imam Ahmad really didn't do aqidah as such, but Abul Hasan theology as such, but Abul Hasan al-Ash'ari and Abu Mansur al-Maturidi did. So in that sense, they are the two schools. Otherwise, in a more broader sense, Ahl Sunnah are three schools in Aqidah. Athari, Hanbali, 1. Ash'ari, 2. Maturidi, 3. Khalas. And then you have some select individuals like Sheikh Saeed Fawda, Hafidhullah Ta'ala, who takes a very strict stance in which he says, no, two schools, and only some of the Hanbalis were Ahl Sunnah. I think he might think that the majority aren't, but most Azhari scholars and most contemporaries of Sayyid Fawda, Sheikh Saeed Fawda, consider him to have a bit of shiddah, over strictness in this, and Allah knows best.
Jazakallahu khair. Alhamdulillah. I think this is about time, so we can wrap it up. So inshallah, we'll see you next week with the final part of this article. Inshallah, then we can move on to some other issues around Kalaam.
So I thought what we do is we'll do the proofs for the existence of God after, where we actually have to deal with Kalaam and contemporary issues, inshallah.
Jazakallahu khair.
Barakallahu feekum, Dr. Salim, and to all of you, may Allah bless you all, may Allah increase you in taysir and tawfiq, and grant us all afiyah fi dunya wal akhirah, and you know, please do keep me in your du'as. Jazakumullah khairan. Subhanallah wa bihamdi. Subhanakallahumma wa hamdik. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.